I met Evelyn when we were both students at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I was getting my master's degree, she was getting her PhD. And she was one of those people who just made the Fletcher family, as we called it, a real family. She was engaged with everyone, was interested in everything, was a friend to all and a colleague to all. She was one of those people that you just admire so much, and everyone admires her so much that you just are dying for her to make one tiny little mistake. I know, okay? From Fletcher, she went on to teach at the Marine War College for 4 years, and then she jumped out of that frying pan, and I can call the Marine thing a frying pan because I was in the Army for 27 years, into the congressional fire for 7 years. She worked as a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I just want to read to you the things that she covered when she was on that committee. Asia Pacific, Western Hemisphere, Special Operations Command, Peace and Stability Operations, Combating Terrorism, Counter-Narcotics, Homeland Defense, and Export Control Policy. So can you imagine all that? And we wonder why the Congress doesn't function, right? Okay. She then served as senior advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. It's a great title, right, Professor Castillo? We love those titles. A senior fellow at the American Security Project and executive director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. From 2012 to 2015, when I was on the Joint Staff, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Since then, Dr. Farkas has applied this amazing span of knowledge as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and is now a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund and CNA. But most famously, if you watch MSNBC, you have seen her there regularly. She's been on The Last Word, Morning Show, other shows. She's been on ABC with Bill Maher. She's been on CNN and other places. You have seen her. You've heard her on NPR, on Deep State Radio, and other places. And you've probably read her too in too many publications to mention. And she's fantastic in all of these fora. She has a way of taking complex problems and simplifying them, and that is a real art. She is bold, she's very courageous, she's highly strategic and contextual, she's humble and she's funny, and you'll see all this today. So throw whatever you want at her. I promise you she can handle it. Ask her about Russia, certainly, but you can ask her about non-proliferation, the Mueller report, domestic American politics, Syria, Ukraine, and grand strategy, I'm sure. But one more thing I have to warn you, she does not have a poker face, right? If something's funny, she laughs. If something's stupid and she's on television, her face says, that was stupid. I'm just warning you, but she's the real deal, the real deal. What you see is what you get. She is authentic. The same person she was back in 1995 is the same person she is today. The girl you just couldn't help but want to be friends with, and the person we all learned from. And I know you're going to learn from her today as well. So without further ado, Dr. Farkas, please.
Okay, now I feel like I should run out of here immediately because Dr. Field, who is my former colleague, as she said, and my friend, has really over-amplified probably who I am and raised expectations. So I will try to deliver. First of all, thank you so much to the school for inviting me. Thank you very much, Dr. Natsios and your team. Thank you, Professor Castillo. And of course, thank you, Kim. Thank you, all of you, for taking time out to watch me give you a quick, hopefully relatively quick and dirty discussion about Russia's objectives and what we can expect as a result and how we should approach Russia. I know that tonight there are other things going on, although maybe you're not so politically junky, you're not such political junkies like we are in Washington, because we would all be glued to our television sets because of the crazy Democratic debates. So I will try to be not as theatrical as the Democratic debates. I will try to be shorter. I will try to be a little bit funny if I can. And And what I really look forward to, I have to be honest, even though I had to prepare something because this is a keynote, I love Q&A, and so I really look forward to hearing what's on your minds. There are a lot of experts in the room right now, and I'm a bit intimidated. They're sitting in the front row, and I think you're going to hear them start snoring soon, because some of this, if you're an expert and you've been paying a lot of attention to Russia and deeply seeped in all of this, some of what I say today will not be new to you at all. But I hope that I put it together in a package that makes it at least a fresh reminder, and then again, at the end, we have a really good conversation. So I will start now, and then, like I said, we will go to Q&A, and I guess I'm moderating that. So to really understand US-Russia relations today, and to begin to craft a strategy for the future, we all must fully grasp, in a clear-eyed fashion, that Russia is a geopolitical threat to the United States, its allies, and partners, to democracy, and to the post-World War II international order. And here I agree 100% with the comment about Russia versus China. We can talk about it later. But Russia is the country that, as I like to say, is in our grill. They are right now in our face, if you will, trying to disrupt our democracy, trying to disrupt the international order. And this, of course, is most unfortunate. The United States did not choose to enter a political war with Russia, and the American people do not and should not harbor ill will towards the Russian people. But make no mistake, the Russian government under Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided to attack American democracy and our interests. It's equally important, of course, to understand why this is the case. The Russian president and his Kremlin have one main objective: to stay in power, to maintain the corrupt, kleptocratic government, the autocratic government they have in Russia today. To achieve this objective, Putin has determined he must demonstrate to the Russian people that he is making Russia great again. Indeed, after Russia's economic growth slowed in 2001, he has found it useful to distract Russians with military adventurism abroad. Putin seeks to reestablish a sphere of influence for Russia, which includes the territory that comprised the former Soviet Union, and if he can get away with it, also the Eastern Bloc. He and his Kremlin cronies don't want an international order based on existing multilateral institutions, the ones that have served democracy, human rights, and the United States so well. No, Moscow instead seeks the old 19th century balance of power system where the strongest countries make the rules, where autocrats are unchallenged by external and internal democratic forces. This world, as we all know, if we've studied some history based on the past, is also a world where nations live in a state of mistrust, arms races, and cycles of protectionism and war. Meanwhile, Putin believes that the United States, the strongest diplomatic, economic, and military power in the world, continues to spread democracy, including to the Russian Federation. Therefore, Putin is determined to make Russia weak, unable and unwilling to support democracy for oppressed peoples. In order to achieve his objectives, Putin and his government have repeatedly violated international law, norms, and human rights. Indeed, Russia is no longer a status quo power. Since 2008, Moscow has been breaking international law and challenging the international order. And a lot of times when I get to this part of the speech, I'll say, okay, here goes the litany of the lamentables. You know, a whole list of like 20 things Russia has done to basically commit crimes against the international order. I've lumped them here together in 10 categories. Starting with, the Russian military invaded neighboring Republic of Georgia in 2008 and continues to occupy 20% of its territory. In 2014, as we all know, Russia invaded Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea. Moscow also ignited a separatist war in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, a conflict that has claimed 13,000 lives and counting. The Kremlin has murdered a list of its enemies in other countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Ukraine, Germany, and most likely in 2015 in the DC death of Mikhail Lesin in the United States. And it has used chemical and nuclear materials to do so. Russian fighters shot down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in 2014 over Ukraine, killing 298 innocent people. Russia has interfered in elections in Western and Eastern Europe and the United States and continues to conduct information operations aimed at sowing discord and division and eroding confidence in democracy. Last March, Putin, never mind. We learned last year from our intelligence community that Russian cyber actors infiltrated our energy and water grids and inserted malware to facilitate potential future attacks on America. Russia violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and several conventional arms control agreements aimed at boosting political and military confidence and reducing the risk of war. Its military continues to conduct unprofessional, risky air operations, buzzing U.S. and allied ships and aircraft. Russian military jets have encroached upon U.S., European, and Japanese airspace at levels not seen since the Cold War, necessitating defensive military maneuvers by our aircraft in response. Russian naval forces continue to violate Ukrainian freedom of navigation rights and to illegally hold 3 vessels seized last November. They recently did return the 23 sailors they've been holding for almost a year as a result of a prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. And the Russian government and its forces have assisted the Syrian military with a deliberate bombing campaign against innocent civilians, hospitals, and a humanitarian convoy. Russia continues to provide military and economic support to the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the illegitimate, devastating rule of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And I do hope we get a chance to talk about Syria in the Q&A. All of this has been supported by an aggressive and targeted military modernization. The Russian military reorganized into regional commands and established a land force brigade to increase the volunteer component of their armed forces. In 2010, the government announced a 10-year, $700 billion plan to provide 70% of the military with modern equipment. The plan has proceeded apace, providing better conventional missiles, among other things, and according to the Russian Minister of Defense, as of last December, nuclear forces that are 82% modernized. Last March, Putin announced Russia was developing new nuclear systems, including a heavy ICBM with an ability to carry multiple warheads, a hypersonic glide vehicle, an autonomous underwater vehicle, and a nuclear-powered cruise missile. This last item, the so-called Skyfall Missile, was the cause of a radioactive explosion on August 8th in Russia during an effort to recover the missile, which had failed to test and fallen into the White Sea. While some see these new nuclear weapons as a Russian attempt to achieve military superiority over the United States, others note they likely represent a Russian response to concerns about U.S. missile defense capabilities, and the answer could be both. For the last decade or so, Russian bombers have been conducting long-range aviation sorties with greater frequency, and submarines and surface Navy vessels have deployed to areas they hadn't been seen in since the Soviet days. Since Putin returned to the presidency in 2011 and appointed Sergei Shoigu Minister of Defense, SNAP conventional and nuclear exercises have become regular military business. The Russian government is overseeing a military buildup in the Arctic, heralded by the establishment of the Arctic Command in December 2014. The Kremlin has deployed the S-400, its most modern missile defense system, and anti-ship missiles to the Arctic. Moscow asserts it has built 475 new military sites and 16 new deep water ports and stationed military personnel at 6 Arctic bases. Russia deployed the nuclear-capable Iskander missile defense system to Kaliningrad and has substantially beefed up its military capabilities in Crimea. Moscow has increased its threatening military posture vis-à-vis Japan, conducting long-range aviation flights over Japan and building up defense facilities for personnel and equipment on 2 of the northern territories / Kuril Islands, whose sovereignty is in dispute between Russia and Japan. That's a legacy of World War II. Finally, the Russian government has come to rely on mercenary forces, most blatantly in Ukraine and Syria, where some of these forces, in the latter place, where some of these forces clashed with U.S. special operators in 2018, resulting in about 100 Russian casualties and about 200 more wounded. Contract forces working for companies run by Putin cronies offer the Kremlin deniability of involvement in military operations and of and of Russian casualties, since unlike the armed forces, these companies are not required to publicly report them. While the Russian people may want their country to be great again, the wars in Ukraine and Syria are not popular. The Russian public is sensitive to casualties in these engagements, and the memory of fierce opposition to the war in Afghanistan, especially from mothers of the soldiers killed, is still sharp in the minds of older Kremlin officials. These private military forces have also helped bolster Russia's political and economic influence on weak autocratic states in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also in Egypt and Libya. Meanwhile, Russian military doctrine has evolved dangerously. In 1993, nuclear first use was no longer explicitly prohibited. But starting with the 2010 military doctrine, Russia has repeatedly declared the right to first use of a nuclear weapon in the event that the existence of the state was at risk. Of course, it is Putin and his Kremlin who determine when the state is at risk. The Russian armed forces also developed a further means to address their conventional inferiority vis-a-vis the West by adopting a deterrence doctrine that relies on nuclear or asymmetric weapons to achieve escalation dominance. This concept is sometimes referred to as escalating to de-escalate. The rationale is by raising the price to the adversary through a cyber attack or a limited nuclear attack, limited use of a nuclear weapon, Russia could force the enemy to capitulate. It could also be a demonstration explosion. Hence the idea of sitting on a US power or energy grid. A shock attack on those grids could send a clear message to the United States to stay out of a conflict or withdraw from a conflict, likely involving what Russia considers its vital interests, so most likely in Europe or Eurasia. I know I'm already depressing you guys and I'm not even done. I'm getting close. Russia, in summary, really is no longer a status quo power. Together with China, which seeks to co-opt rather than destroy the international order at this point, Moscow aims to return to a 19th century sphere of influence, international disorder. Again, we know from history that this alternative to the current global order leads to great power military competition, economic protectionism, and ultimately war. Russia would like nothing better than a United States uncoupled from alliances that have brought us unprecedented military, economic, and diplomatic success. That means NATO, our only operational collective security alliance, but also our commitments in Asia, to Israel, and elsewhere. So what have we done in response to this? Well, we have taken concerted military, diplomatic, and economic action. We have bolstered deterrence, especially in NATO's eastern areas of vulnerability to Russia, and provided valuable military, energy, and economic assistance to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Balkan, and other states neighboring Russia, or laboring under Russian pressure tactics. Since Ukraine is very much in the news these days, I'm going to take a few minutes just to pause on it. The United States has provided Ukraine with $320 million in non-military aid per year from 2015 to 2018, and $1.5 billion in security assistance since 2014. We also provided in the crucial early years after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, $3 billion in vital loan guarantees to Ukraine. The European Union and its financial institutions have provided more than $16.5 billion in grants and loans to Ukraine for its economic and political reform efforts since 2014. On top of that, many nations have pledged millions of dollars of bilateral assistance, including Germany, the United Kingdom, and Japan. Indeed, without much fanfare, Japan actually has given $3.1 billion in assistance to Ukraine since the early 1990s. And I love that fact, and I am a big supporter of Japan for many reasons. They're a really good ally. And when I was staffing Secretary Ash Carter at the NATO Council, where all the defense ministers meet, I gave him, as part of his speech, he had a whole section where he had to say what all the allies had done, and then he would include Japan. And I knew he was going to turn around and say, Japan? And I had this card with everything Japan had done. And I was so proud of that. And it was also very helpful when we needed Japanese help with sanctions vis-a-vis Russia to kind of give them the credit and tell them to keep going. So yes, if you did the math and you noticed the numbers, Europeans have contributed an estimated 2/3 of all the aid to Ukraine since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And this, I would say, is probably the most important thing we have done and continue to do on behalf of democracy and the international order. Putin's greatest fear is that Ukraine will achieve the objectives of its new young president, Vladimir Zelensky, that Ukraine's democratic state will become a thriving, free market economy, free of systematic corruption. For if the Ukrainian people can succeed in achieving this ambition, the aspiration that brought them to the streets in 2014 to protest their corrupt pro-Russian government, then why can't the Russian people follow suit? And I think most of you would agree they deserve no less. So let's take stock. We have deterred Russia from taking more territory in Ukraine or on its periphery, on Russia's periphery, and from conventional or unconventional attack on or invasion of NATO countries. We have caused some social and economic pain to Putin cronies through sanctions. But we have not stopped Russia from waging war in Ukraine, remember the hot war in Donbass, inhibiting freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, conducting cyber and information operation attacks against the United States, our allies and partners. Indeed, with just with regard to the 2020 elections alone, experts are uncovering new attacks and warning campaigns to improve their security almost daily. There is every reason to believe Putin's aggressive foreign policy will continue unabated until he is no longer in office, which at the moment officially is 2024. Putin is the politically weakest he has been since 2014. Public anger arose in the aftermath of a government decision, I believe it was last year, to increase, maybe earlier this year, the pension age. And we witnessed the largest, broadest demonstrations against the regime this past summer, against corruption and the barring of opposition candidates from running for Moscow City Council positions. So things could change suddenly in Russia, as they have throughout its history. But until the day a more pragmatic government emerges, one that puts the Russian people first, we must stand firm. And I would argue that we have not been firm enough. We must continue, so this is for the next president, we must continue to counter the threats posed by Russia. In Europe, the US and NATO must keep providing the military support and advice to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, including lethal defensive ground, maritime, and air systems. The US must help prepare Bosnia and Kosovo, the two remaining Balkan aspirants for NATO membership, and neutralize the threat posed by Russian influence and presence in the region. NATO members must contribute more to building military conventional and asymmetric capabilities. All allies, of course, should meet their pledge to spend 2% of their GDP on defense and invest 20% of that in major capabilities by 2024. NATO should also establish a fund to help Eastern European allies and partners who continue to depend on Russian equipment, legacy Soviet equipment, basically. This continued reliance on Russian systems is a vulnerability Moscow will exploit. And I'm leaving out the Turkey problem. We could do that on Q&A, because as many know, Turkey is now purchasing Russian weapons, and they're in the NATO system, and that creates a vulnerability for us. To counter bad actors such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, so this is not limited just to Russia, NATO should define cyber attacks or hybrid little green men operations that would trigger Article 5 and develop more exercises and plans in these areas. So I had the opportunity this summer to go to Brussels, and I can't talk too much about it, but one of the things I was dealing with the representatives to the NATO Security Council, the permanent representatives, so those are the ambassadors. And ours is former Senator, now Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison. And they were engaged in an exercise. And one of the things I concluded was it's very important to have strong asymmetric deterrence, because if you don't, there's the danger then that you being NATO, the United States, you grab for conventional military rather than respond in the asymmetric realm. So I think that's a real urgent requirement, I would say, for the United States and for our NATO allies in particular. We must, of course, here in the United States, increase our defenses against cyber and information operations. That, people write whole books and articles on that topic alone. Globally, we must deepen our targeted sanctions against Russia, but also broaden them to gain participation from allies outside of Europe. I don't believe we did a good enough job in the past with that, and we need to have more countries joining us in sanctioning Russian cronies and those companies and individuals who enable Putin's aggressive foreign policy. The United States and our democratic allies and partners should increase funding for civil society, independent media, and organizations focused on anti-corruptions worldwide. And that includes Russia, if we can. And of course, it's hard because it's illegal in Russia. At the same time, we must maintain communication with the Russian government to decrease the risk of military conflict and to explain the dangers of Russia's military doctrine and doomsday weapons. We should also explore areas for potential mutual gain in arms control and combating terrorism. You never know when one side or the other will come up with an idea and something might be possible. We must also continue to reach out to the Russian people and to find ways to support their efforts to defend their human rights, achieve greater political freedom and economic opportunity. Finally, and most importantly, and I've said this in testimony before Congress earlier this year, I was a little bit wagging my finger, verbally at least, America and our allies must renew our vows to democracy. Democratic backsliding can't be ignored, especially when Russia works every day to cripple our societies and politics. We must heed the warning of the authors of How Democracies Die. Democracies die, just as a reminder of what this is the cliff notes of the book, when leaders, 1, refuse to play by democratic rules, 2, delegitimize their opponents, 3, tolerate or encourage violence, and 4, are prepared to curtail the civil rights of political opponents and the media. We must shore up our democracy and improve the processes and functioning of its institutions. We must ensure civility and democratic culture. We must fight corruption and improve our capitalist system to provide transparency, opportunity, and basic well-being for all Americans. That, ladies and gents, is how we prevail over Putin and set the stage for a better future for Russia and the US-Russia relationship. And I'm now happy to take your questions. And I'll probably walk around a little bit because I'm cold standing in one place. So. It's cold, yeah. Dr. Natsios.
One of the journals of public health that a lot of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States is actually generated in Russia through this asymmetrical warfare. It's one thing for them to disrupt our democracy. Why would they spread stories that vaccines are dangerous? It's a public health question. What's their motivation for doing that?
Yeah, well, if you recall, this is kind of an old Soviet trick, this disinformation, because during the Soviet days, they used disinformation about AIDS to mislead the American public and create some hysteria. You raise a valid point. Are they really trying to kill American babies or older Americans who are not vaccinated? I don't think that's the intent. The intent is to distract, to cause dissension. They know it's an issue where people feel really emotional. Even President Trump himself has said he thinks vaccines could cause autism. So, the Russians know where our weak spots are, where our areas of friction are. Obviously, race is another one. They're all over our racial issues on the internet and elsewhere, creating fake demonstrations. I remember in 2015 when I was in the Pentagon very clearly, and my colleague, who was my deputy in the office at the time, she was in charge of everyone in the office, Black Lives Matter was coming to the fore, and there were demonstrators, and I looked at her and I said, I know this is a valid, obvious, valid movement, and there are real grievances here and real problems, but I bet you $1 million the Russians are somewhere in there mucking around. And sure enough, they were. We found out they were. The other thing they like to do is separatism. So we're here in Texas. Two of the biggest fake separatist movements that we have in the United States have been funded by Russia. One of the guys was in California. He fled to Moscow, so I think that one's defunct. I don't know about the Texas one, but these existed virtually, funded by Russia, to try to create tension. And what's the objective? Well, again, if you remember what our intelligence community told us, what the Mueller report also concluded based on the intelligence work that was done before he got into the office even, was that the Russians wanted to sow discord. They wanted to make us not trust our democracy, and they also sort of favored Donald Trump. So some of these things also were to kind of tamp down, maybe depress the African-American turnout, for example, because they figured that would help Hillary Clinton, and it would, and the African-American turnout, that is. So they tried to depress it, by saying, don't vote for Hillary, she's, X, Y, and Z. There was a lot of, in fact, a disproportionate amount of the propaganda on Facebook, et cetera, was directed at African Americans for that reason. Does that help?
So I like the comment you made about Russia's in our grill.
Yeah.
And when I teach this, I always say the opposite, that we're in Russia's grill.
Oh.
When I think of the list of grievances you made, I think of the list of grievances that Russia might counter.
Mm-hmm.
Told them we wouldn't unify Germany. We did. We told them we wouldn't put a unified Germany in NATO. We did. We expanded NATO twice. Got rid of the ABM treaty. Then we put missile defense almost in their grill. So I wonder what's the right strategy for Russia if it's not happy with the international order? What's the right strategy for Russia if it feels like we're in its grill? What's a legitimate way of challenging the international order if you got some legitimate grievances? One idea that you mentioned is Russia's looking for a sphere of influence. Why not give them a sphere of influence?
Okay, so I like that. I like that question because there are times when I give, how do I say it? The benefit of the doubt is too strong, but my beef in particular with Russia is not necessarily how they view their geostrategic situation as you just laid out. It's what they've done to try to achieve their objectives. So of course I would say, not this, don't do any of that, and play by the rules. Before I get to that part of the answer, though, I do want to say, I agree with you. I think we did a lot of things to make this, to contribute to the situation that we have with Russia. What do I mean by that? I know that, President George H.W. Bush, very much feeling his presence here. And by the way, what a foreign policy genius administration that was. I mean, unparalleled really in my lifetime. And don't tell everyone I said that. Don't tell those I served. But really phenomenal. Everything that administration was hit with, they handled expertly. The only thing they didn't handle quite so perfectly, and if they'd had a little more time, I believe maybe they would have, because Lawrence Eagleberger finally figured it out in the dawning days, was Yugoslavia. But how could you blame them when everything else that was so consequential they handled very well? And George H.W. Bush and his administration understood, don't gloat. But not everybody got the message, right? And so a lot of Americans were running around gloating. So that was the first thing, we were not. And beyond that, because Madeleine Albright often will say, we were respectful, we welcomed them in as equals. And my answer to that is, and I love Madeleine Albright, I'm a huge fan of hers, but my answer to that is, they didn't want to be welcomed in as equals. They didn't want to be France, they didn't want to be Austria. They were the former Soviet Union. They wanted to be like us, not like those small countries. And that we didn't quite get. Bill Clinton understood it in the way he handled Yeltsin. If you read how he handled Yeltsin, he treated him still like a big, leader of a large landmass, et cetera, with a lot of resources. And it worked, to a large extent. But there was a certain amount of hubris that they picked up on, rightfully. And we didn't understand that they're not going to all of a sudden get over their empire. And part of what the Russian people legitimately, there's a lot of literature on this too, and a lot of Nobel Prizes have been won based on that literature, looking at the trauma that the Russian people have experienced. So there is a real issue there that Putin is also addressing when he says make Russia great again. The other thing I would say, as somebody who witnessed what happened with the ABM treaty on the Hill, so I was working for Carl Levin at the time, and he was very much opposed to the U.S. abrogating the ABM treaty, so withdrawing from the ABM treaty, because he understood we have mutual assured destruction. It works. Why mess with it? But for the Bush administration, a totally valid reason, but different, was we got to do something about these rogue, actors, Iraq at the time, Iran, North Korea. They could lob a missile at us. So this is not about Russia. Forget about Russia, that's old news. We got to do this missile defense thing. But the Russians immediately saw, well, this is totally destabilizing. This is untenable. And so that was the beginning of a lot of things that then occurred over time, where we ignored, for example, after 9/11, the Russian government under Putin said, we're on your side, we're going to help you. And we were, okay, thanks, we didn't manage them quite so well. And they have legitimate concerns. I get a little bit impatient, though, with the encirclement, because I don't know whether the Russian people worry that much about encirclement day to day. And even the military, they know that they can deter us. But I can understand why they would want assurances. And so, I think there is a lot of room for assurances. We had very good conventional arms control, and the Russians are the ones who started mucking around with that. Yes, we expanded, though, and that's a valid point. We came up with a mechanism for it, we thought, that would work with the NATO-Russia Council. Obviously, it didn't. So my beef is mainly with the means that the Russians have employed. Maybe we could find a way to negotiate certain confidence measures with them, but the sphere of influence is a no-go. And I say this as a Hungarian American, somebody whose family hails from Eastern Europe. The Ukrainian people, they want the right to determine their own political system and their affiliations internationally. They don't want Russia telling them who they're going to, that they have to do business with Russia, that they have to be part of Russia's, Eurasian Economic Union, which is a corrupt, loser for them, right? So understandably, they want to be rich like Poland, that's basically what happened. And I don't think it's for us to tell those people that they can't determine their futures. Yes, we don't have to be aggressive about democratic change in countries, and I would argue that we haven't been, and certainly not as aggressive as Vladimir Putin thinks we have been, because, he'd probably be gone by now if we were so aggressive. So I guess it really comes down to me you cannot say no to those people and those countries. It's their right to decide, do they want to be part of NATO, and it's the right of NATO to say you can join, and same with the EU.
Yes, 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Okay, I'm Larry Napper. I'm a professor of the practice here at the Bush School. You mentioned we should be on the lookout for opportunities, albeit limited, to to cooperate on certain things, or at least to keep the spiral from further spiraling.
Yeah.
One, and I want to ask you a specific thing in the arms control arena. Would you, do you favor an extension of the New START treaty, which will otherwise expire in February 2021?
Yes, absolutely. I think for a couple of reasons. Practical reasons, because it does allow us to do some inspection, to have some sense of what's happening in Russia and vice versa. So again, practical terms. Also for the principle of it. I think to walk away from that arms control agreement means then we have no functioning arms control agreements with Russia anymore. And I don't see how that makes the world a safer place. And it would not be very hard, I don't think, to extend. I'm not in the administration right now, admittedly, and it's always easier from the outside. But the Russian government, I don't think they're interested in necessarily building up their stockpile or spending the money on it. I think they feel that they have sufficient deterrence in the nuclear realm. Their concern is more in the conventional. And so I think that we could get to an agreement with them if we were so inclined. Of course, they would make it painful. That's just the way it goes when you're negotiating with Russia. But I think it's important to try. And moreover, I think we should try for other newer mechanisms. It's deeply regrettable that the administration is pulling out, our administration is pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty. I understand why there were a lot of problems with it. I personally had a lot of problems with it and had a lot of fights with my colleagues at the State Department because I felt they were too lenient on the Russians. And I said, if we're going to do arms control, it only matters if we're strict. And the Russians were cheating, and the Russians were misusing the treaty. And so I would have preferred that we try to make the Russians behave better or take a more stepward approach. But the current administration has people in it that I know personally. I worked with them on the Hill, and they don't believe that arms control serves a useful purpose. And they don't trust the Russians to not cheat at all, which, again, it's not a question of trust, but they just are anti-arms control, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Okay, so my question is in regards to, on the news a lot lately, they've been talking about Russian gas and energy. And I know that tap and transit are big weapons used by Russia in this situation. But specifically, they've called on the United States and the European Union to intervene in some way to help because, to quote Game of Thrones, winter is coming. So is there a role for the United States and the European Union? And if so, how can those two nations help?
Yeah, okay. And if other people have questions, just come to the microphone, and stand in line. So I would say, with regard to energy security, when I first got into the Obama administration, the energy security situation was not good. I mean, the Europeans were largely dependent on Russia for oil and natural gas. Since then, and especially since 2014, the European Union and the United States has worked to diversify, to create alternatives to the Russian supply. But there's still no getting away from the fact that Russia is the major supplier to the region. The Germans created Nord Stream, which is a direct line between Germany and Russia, and they want to create another one. Personally, I agree here with President Trump, who has different reasons, slightly different reasons than mine, for wanting to oppose a second Nord Stream, because I think it's safer for Ukraine and for the region to have the Russians dependent somewhat on Ukraine for the transit of the gas through their territory. And yes, Ukraine gets some fees from that. I'm not as interested in the fees. I'm more interested in having Russia have an incentive to treat Ukraine somewhat better or not any worse than it's treating it right now. So I think I'm with President Trump on opposing the Nord Stream project, but it looks like it's going to go forward. President Trump would like to sell more U.S. liquefied natural gas to the Europeans, and we have started to, I believe, sell some to the Baltic states. We helped them build facilities so that they could accept some liquefied natural gas and store, I believe, in Lithuania. But this is an area where there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But the reality is, I would say it's urgent to some extent, but it's not as urgent as you would think, only because having that dependency does go both ways. Russia has to sell the oil and gas to the West. So if we can, steel our spines for our Eastern European brethren, and then we can actually have some leverage over them.
So I wanted to ask you, given the situation in Syria, do you believe that there's a connection between that and some of Russia's other malign activities in the Mediterranean, such as Malta, but especially the penetration into the financial system of Cyprus, which is very nearby?
Yeah, okay, so first of all, for the Russian government, this kleptocracy, Number one, they rely on sales of oil and gas and arms, and they need banking relationships where they can launder, because there's a lot of corruption going on in these various sales. Yeah, I mean, you probably are following a little bit the Ukraine business. Dmitry Firtash is a guy who made millions of dollars just on taking a cut from the Gazprom, the gas that would go from Russia to Ukraine, and he would just take the money and then use the money to help Russia achieve its objectives, which I gather he's still doing today from Vienna. So what the Russians do is they want these relationships in order to make their money, and then the Russian military also would like to have influence, would like to have logistics, areas for logistics. They would like to have a presence like they did during the Cold War. And so Russia has sought out areas in the Mediterranean where they can have ports. They had for a long time the port in Syria, and they now have an airfield in Syria as well. And judging by the news, they probably will have air superiority over all of Syria before long. I mean, within days maybe. We'll see, depending on what our president does. So it's not a strategy per se. When I discuss the objectives and then I say what the Kremlin does, it's not as if there's a strategy. There's a big debate. Is Putin a strategist? And I think most of the people that I know who study Putin closely say, no, he's not a strategist. I mean, sure, he's smart, but he's a good opportunist. He knows how to take the best of any situation operationally and achieve for himself what he needs to achieve. He's a risk taker. I remember Ambassador John Teft. He was one of our ambassadors to Russia while I was working in the Obama administration. He said that he's a judo player, so he uses the weaknesses of his advantage to gain dominance. But he also is a poker player. He takes risk. And you saw, the seizure of Crimea, that was a hugely risky operation, and he did it. And this is why, I probably should have said it also in my address, why we need to be firm towards the Kremlin, because if Putin sees opportunity, he's not afraid of risk. And if we don't stand up to Putin, that is the thing I worry about most, for example, in the Syria case right now. If you don't stand up to Putin, he will see you as weak and see opportunity elsewhere. So it's very important to hold firm.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So my name is Ramil Kazmov. I'm coming from the Republic of Azerbaijan, which is just south of Russia. And
I've been there.
Yeah, great.
Many times.
I totally resonate with what you said, because historically we have been subject of Russian invasion. Even nowadays, you probably are aware very well that due to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, they still pull strings over that conflict. And we all know that just the reasons you mentioned, economically Russia isn't very good, and there are now protests against the Putin, and I would even say against his legacy. I'm also not worried about the democracy, even in Russia or in the world, because U.S. I think taking a very good lead. Like the Fulbright, I'm a Fulbright student, therefore people like me, they choose the U.S. and the West rather than Russia. Those people like with low labor or low skills, they prefer to go to Russia or other countries. So I'm not worried about the democracy. I'm also not worried about the military power of Russia, because I think U.S. has got a lot and a strong military power compared to U.S. And once the U.S. military budget stands out as an example of that. But what I'm a bit worried is why U.S. is always portrayed as a weaker when compared compared to Russia. So what do you think? What are the roots that like even in the U.S. I see that.
Who?
Well, I hope you
I
wouldn't
think
get
I know
offended.
the answer, but
I hope you wouldn't get offended. I could sense from your speech as well that when you compare militarily, I had a sense that Russia stands out, and because of its invasions, like my countries, they have done, or in Ukraine, in Georgia, and in Transnistria, we can say as well. So what do you think, why there's such a perception we have been hearing for such a long time? So why do you think, what are the root causes of having that?
That's a really good question. That makes sense. I certainly didn't spend time. So my expertise is really in U.S.-Russia relations. I don't consider myself a Russia expert, meaning I have not lived and studied in Russia. I speak like Russian 101, меня зовут Evelyn, like хорошо. So I try not to go too far into discussing what's happening in Russia internally, because again, I feel like that I can leave that to other people. Having said that, I probably could have put a few more sentences about the vulnerability, the weaknesses of Russian society. Certainly we know economically there's no innovation going on there. The younger people are leaving. I mean, there are Russians who aren't Jewish going to Israel. The Washington Post does these really good stories about medical doctors going to Israel. But of course, other all kinds of Russians going other places because there's no opportunity, because it's such a kleptocratic, corrupt system. You can't get ahead unless your daddy is somebody close to Putin, practically. So it's that's one weakness. The other one is, of course, the demographics and the society. There's a lot of still, problems with alcoholism, and the government doesn't address it in a healthy fashion. This is similar to problems with AIDS and health issues the Russians have across the board, where they're not as directly addressing it with the people in a constructive fashion, oftentimes stigmatizing victims. What else? Of course, so the birth rate has gone down, the population's shrinking, the Chinese are buying real estate, and all of that. So I don't mean to build Russia up. It's a declining power, but oftentimes the declining powers are the ones that are the most dangerous. And so what I'm trying to highlight is how dangerous Russia is, not that it's so strong. But I can see your point, because I'm often, I don't want to get too political, but I'm often wagging my finger at the television, because sometimes I find political leaders, and in particular our president, talks about Russia like it's stronger than the United States. And there's kind of a deference that he pays to the Russian leader, which I don't really understand, since, as I said already before, we're far and above the strongest economic military power in the world. And I'm going to pause on political and diplomatic, because right now our political and diplomatic capital has just sunk through the basement because of what happened in Syria. So, and maybe some other things prior to that. So I would just say that, yes, people need to step back and understand Russia is not China. China looks like it's still in the ascent economically, although they also are a country with many vulnerabilities. And I didn't mention Russia's environmental problems as well. So I don't mean to build them up too much, yeah. But they are a near-term problem.
So good evening. My name is Jared Bajos. I'm a second year. Was very fortunate to just return, actually, from this past week. I attended the Riga conference in Latvia. So I just got a little bit of a sense, definitely, for the Baltic states and some of our other colleagues and constituents we got to meet there. And they definitely appreciate NATO's enhanced forward presence battalions there. And one of the key elements of that they mentioned to me that was very, very important to them was U.S. presence. So just in regard to EFP, to U.S. presence, what's your opinion on, as far as deterrence, increasing U.S. presence there for the right reasons, but what might be kind of the trigger, since Russia is maybe a little bit more desperate depending on situation and everything else, if it is a declining power and a little bit more willing to take risk, what might be that line between bolstering deterrence and not crossing over to making it to where we actually, trigger something else?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. We had this question of what threatens Russia and what is, what's defensive and what's offensive. And I was part of a group at the Atlantic Council that looked at this question within the context of Poland's request for this Trump, what do they call it? For Trump, exactly. And so we looked at all the various proposals, and what we ended up deciding was it wasn't so much about increasing the forces, it was more about what types of forces or what kinds of headquarters or what kinds of enablers are nearby, having equipment positioned there so that when the people come later, the equipment is already there. You don't have to also bring the equipment over. So it was really more that, aviation, not just land, because there was a heavy emphasis, especially because of what happened in Ukraine. We derived all of our lessons learned from that and looked and said, okay, that was that was the land situation, so we have to, worry about the land. And over time now, of course, we've become more sophisticated, not just with regard to how we support Ukraine, but also with regard to our own deterrence. But I think the answer is not in putting large forces there. It's more making sure we have enablers. And then I think ultimately, really, it comes down to political will, just communicating to the Russians that don't take a toe in, whether it's an asymmetric, person who's not wearing a uniform, who's like a fifth column, security force, what have you, or a conventional Russian military force. Don't even try it because we'll take action. So I think what's more important is showing that political will, which in part NATO does when it does these exercises, like the one that I was part of.
We have time for one quick question.
All right, I'll try. Hopefully this will be quick. Thank you. And while you were speaking, you mentioned kind of an alarming list of things in the ways that Russia is interacting with the United States. And so that, in my mind, that raises the question, from your highly specialized expertise and perspective, what are the greatest intelligence and counterintelligence needs that the U.S. has with regards to Russia?
Wow, that's a really good question. So I think, I wish I had that blanket. So I think one point I want to make, because this came up a lot during the Mueller early time, actually pre-Mueller. So when the America and the world first learned that the Russians had attacked our elections, and the intelligence community was looking into this, and there was a lot of, I think, and continues to be a lot of misunderstanding about how we know these things, and of course I can't tell you how we know these things, but what I can tell you is, unlike North Korea or China or many other countries, even though, I gave you earlier how we took our eye off Russia and we said, oh, they're not really a threat, we got to do terrorism and we got to deal with these rogue states and all of that, we actually maintained really good intelligence on Russia. So we have really good intelligence. I would imagine by now we have more analysts looking at various sources, but our intelligence is not so bad. I think we probably could use we could always use better intelligence on the intentions of the leadership, although I think our analysts did a really good job painting that for us. The reason I became an expert in my job in 3 years in the Pentagon was in large part not just because I was reading books and all that and I had existing knowledge, but a lot of it was really the fantastic work that the intelligence analysts did and the products that they brought me, and I read them all and I listened and I learned a lot. So I think that's important to get the strategic perspective. I'm sure we are lacking with regard to understanding the Russian people and what's going on internally, given all of the cutbacks in the embassy personnel, et cetera. But again, I tend to not think that that's such a vulnerability. I will say, maybe we could be cleverer about how we reach out to the Russian people. I alluded to that earlier, because I think there may be opportunities to reach them that we haven't been trying. And interestingly, though, as I said, Ukraine is so important. now, even more important, not just because of the example it provides to the Russian people, but because the Russian people might actually pay attention because they know this new president because he's a guy they've seen on their TV. They watch Zelensky's program. So they might actually be curious and be watching a little bit more than otherwise. Plus, he's been quite funny in television and in the social media vis-a-vis Putin. When Putin's made comments, then he will kind of make, you want a visa to go to Russia? It doesn't seem like a really nice vacation to me, but go ahead. So I mean, he's very, he uses sarcasm. So.
On that note.
And by the way, I can't go to Russia. We were bonding over this. You get to this point where you're so frank, they don't like you anymore.
We look forward to seeing you next. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.